All right, we've got a couple people coming in. Thank you to everyone joining us this evening for our event celebrating the release of the Letters of Shirley Jackson, edited by Laurence Jackson Hyman. Just before we get started, I'd like to remind you that any questions and comments you have for our authors tonight, you can enter into the Q&A and the chat boxes, and there will be time for answers just at the top of the hour. And for our featured guests tonight, we have Jonathan Lethem, who is the best-selling author of 12 novels, including The Arrest, The Feral Detective, The Fortress of Solitude, and Motherless Brooklyn, winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. He currently teaches creative writing at Pomona College in California. And Bernice M. Murphy is an associate professor lecturer in popular literature at the School of English, Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. She edited the collection Shirley Jackson, Essays on the Literary Legacy, and has written several articles and book chapters on Jackson's writing. She is also an expert on American horror and Gothic narratives. Her current work in progress is a monograph entitled The California Gothic in Fiction and Film. And Laurence Jackson Hyman, the eldest child of Shirley Jackson and Stanley Edgar Hyman, has spent most of his professional life in publishing as a writer, photographer, editor, art director, and publisher. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of dozens of books and monographs, including 2 posthumous collections of his mother's stories, Just an Ordinary Day and Let Me Tell You. He was an executive producer for the 2018 film adaptation of We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, such a pleasure. I'm a longtime fan of Green Apple Books. I miss browsing in that shop, and I'm such a longtime fan of Shirley Jackson's writing. It almost is a preconscious affiliation for me because I don't really remember the first time I read either the short story The Lottery or the short story One Ordinary Day with Peanuts. I only know that they were being reread by me over and over again through my childhood, and they felt like talismanic objects. And later I became a devotee of her great novels, and I suppose I sort of was lucky enough to come of age in the period of the renaissance of her work, and I enjoyed both of those volumes. It's a real honor to meet you, Laurence. Those posthumous collections were really exciting events. And in fact, one of the first times I ever wrote a book review or an essay about a book in a public setting was my old friend Laura Miller was editing at Salon when Salon was very new, and invited me to write about Shirley Jackson's writing on the occasion of the first of the 2 posthumous, discovered story collections, which was a real thrill for me. So she was even sort of part of my learning to do something other than write fiction myself, because I was very, very slow to come into the world of book reviewing and criticism. And Bernice, I'm honored to meet you and excited to hear about your work. I want to know about the California Gothic eventually, but I won't take our time today with that. Instead, we'll talk about this new, amazing, beautiful, and really absorbing collection of Shirley Jackson's letters, which you worked on together. And of course, one of my questions will be about process. I want to know how you 2 came to be in collaboration on this work, and some of what it consisted of. And we can talk about anything that comes to mind and about her work generally. I'm sure that the people who are with us are already fans and excited to think about Shirley Jackson's writing. And at the 3/4 mark, as promised, we'll take questions from the audience. So please think of them, and I'll pull them out of the chat and the Q&A and represent them to Bernice and Laurence. So don't be shy about giving us some questions to work with in the last 15 minutes, okay? So yeah, there is my first question for you. What is the origin story? How did you come to understand that, Laurence, that you wanted there to be a collection of the letters? How long has it been in progress, and how and when did you become involved, Bernice?
Okay, I've known for years that the that the letters would be published, should be published. I had the letters from my mother to her parents. And when I first moved to California, Geraldine Jackson, Shirley's mother, presented me with a box of them and said, "Here are your mother's letters. We've been collecting them since 1948." Odd that they started that year, because that's when Shirley published The Lottery, and they must have figured that they should start keeping them. They hadn't kept them before that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it took me a while to dig into them, and I was a bit hesitant to read them at first. But a few weeks later I did, and I recognized instantly the yellow paper she always used and the familiar typewriter font. And once I started reading, I was just transported back into, I think, 1952 or something. You know, it just was our family life of those days. So I wanted to publish them for years, and I just haven't really figured out until recently, somewhat recently, a way to do it. And then I decided 3 or 4 years ago that the proper way would be to collect as many letters as we could from Shirley to other people and distill them and see what we had. So I started collecting them and found that there were a great many. In addition to the ones I had from Shirley to her parents, I had all the Brant and Brant files. So I had voluminous back and forth between Bernice Baumgarten, who was Shirley's first major agent, and then Carol Brant, both of them of Brant and Brant Literary Agency. And they're wonderful. And I knew those needed a place. And then I had the letters from between my parents from the late 30s. And then Ruth Franklin sent me a batch of the Jean Beatty letters, which are marvelous, and the Allison letters, and a few others that she had found. And then I found the Libby Burke letters. And so, you know, it began to take shape maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And when Murray's our agent, approached Random House, they were very excited about it. And they suggested that I identify an academic consultant. Mm-hmm. And I thought instantly of Bernice, because we had met previously in Ireland, and I was very impressed with her. And she's done a book of essays already, of texts about my mother's work. So I thought that was a great choice. And indeed, it was a magnificent choice. It turned out. She was wonderful to work with. And it went very smoothly. We then met in San Francisco and talked about the letters and how we might go about culling them and editing them and what our objectives might be. And we seemed in total agreement. And so we were off and running. And it's been great ever since. I've really valued Bernice's input and backup and insight. It's been great.
It's terrific. Bernice, what led you to Shirley Jackson's writing to begin with? I mean, it isn't hard to become entranced with, but.
Stephen King. I read Danse Macabre when I was about 15. Mm-hmm. It blew my mind, as rightly it should have. And he kept going on about this woman called Shirley Jackson. And I've said this to Laurence, you couldn't actually get Jackson in Ireland. There wasn't really an internet at that stage. This was in the 1990s. Her books were, if you wanted to order them, they were actually incredibly expensive. Many of them were out of print. But when it came for me several years later to decide on a PhD topic, I decided quite fortuitously I would write about Shirley Jackson. And I couldn't believe that. So it's not to say that there hadn't been any academic work done on her. There'd been some excellent work done on her, but not that much. So I couldn't believe this. And my supervisor at the time, when I came towards the end of my PhD, said, you know, what publication on Jackson don't you believe exists, and, you know, make it exist. So mm-hmm. The obvious thing was to collect some of the really outstanding work that had been done thus far, but also I was able to get some new essays, and that's how it was actually the first ever edited essay collection on Jackson, which seems hard to believe, given that there's been such wonderful work done since. So that's how Laurence might remember this was 15 odd years ago. I sent him a very scared email because the publisher said, you have to contact the estate and ask them. And I remember being terrified. And Laurence was just so nice and really delighted that work was being done. And so we kind of encountered each other a little bit then, but then obviously more recently had reconnected in Dublin, and I happened to be researching my California book in California, and fortuitously was able to meet up with Laurence. So that's really, I mean, what is it, Laurence? It's been kind of 2 years really since we've started. It's been a very, quite a quick actually process in a lot of ways. Of course, COVID happened. It's been a year of that.
Yeah. I think it's been a bit longer, but not a lot. And we've done our work, our editorial work together in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah.
It's great. So I'm going to stick closely to the book with a couple of more, at least a couple of further questions that are really particular to it, because I'm just so I'm so taken with it, and I've been refreshing myself today in preparation to talk. One thing that your initial description of how the materials accumulated didn't touch on, Laurence, that I'm quite curious about, is that you had the supply of letters that were received by your grandparents, and you have the supplies of letters that were received by the agency and the different agents, and other letters that were sent. But the book is marked by the presence of 3 or 4, at least, for really piercing and remarkable unsent letters. And those are, to me, a kind of it's like a secret skeleton or a ghost haunting the house of this book. These remarkable addresses, but that were never received. At what point were those? Did those become part of the project, and how did you two decide that they belonged in the book?
Well, that was a tough decision. I wrestled with that, and in fact, Bernice and I together wrestled with the idea of whether we should or shouldn't publish them. They didn't fit in one way. I mean, they were not sent, but we felt that they were such important literary documents and detailed really important facets of Shirley's personality. They're very revealing. It's hard to know whether the one to her mother after the St. Regis party is understandable. She was just angry, and she just wrote that out and didn't send it. And indeed, about 2 weeks later, sent a very cheerful, chirpy letter saying, "Oh, by the way, we had a nice time at St. Regis," and she never mentioned it to her. The other one, the unsent letter to Stanley, was much harder, and we decided finally that it was too important not to include. That
it's extraordinary.
Yeah, it is, and it's not pleasant, to read, because you sense her immense frustration and loneliness as she discusses it. So it's a very unhappy letter, and it's not the sort of thing she often wrote, as you know. I mean, most of her letters were very cheerful and very chirpy, and she would spend her time making uproarious stories out of family calamities, which is what she did, and beautifully and wonderfully. But we felt that those letters should be in the book, and indeed went forward with them.
No, it's a crucial decision. I'm so relieved that you did. They're electrifying, and the contrast that they set up, as you say, between this kind of managed storytelling, which is very intimate and compelling, but it's also unmistakably a performance. This is how we're going to be. This is how we're going to understand this family, and this is going to how we're understand, my life and my career in this kind of droll, self-effacing, comedic way. So when you get these, it's almost like a flash X-ray of another layer of her psyche when she writes the letters not to be sent.
Yes, that's true. But I always hasten to say that we children were totally unaware of any problems between our parents. Totally unaware. always assumed that they were intellectual sparring partners, which they certainly were.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there was no venom, and that they loved each other. And Shirley certainly loved her children. And, my childhood was very happy and very challenging intellectually with that group, because the house was always filled with people like Kenneth Burke and
Ralph Ellison.
Yeah, Ralph lived with us in Connecticut the year he was finishing Invisible Man. And he also taught me to play, or helped teach me to play trumpet. And we later played lots of trumpet, but that's another story. Anyway, he lived with us, and Stanley was sort of helping him a bit with Invisible Man.
Mhm.
Ralph at the same time would spend half his day down in our cellar building transistor radios, which was his real love.
Do you also recall the visit of Dylan Thomas?
I don't.
No.
I don't recall it. I'm sure it happened, but I don't know how it happened. I'm not sure. Stanley used to make jokes about his Dylan Thomas chasing Shirley around the house, and
Yeah.
Stanley was trying to watch a ball game, a Brooklyn Dodgers game. Would keep going past the little 9x9-inch television set, and finally they came through one more time, and Shirley lumbered ahead, and Stanley caught Dylan Thomas by the belt and pulled him down. Now that was Stanley's version. There are others.
It's I've read each of the two biographies of your mother, and then once you have the letters as well, and in hearing you paraphrasing your father's version of the story, his informal version, one has the sense of a storytelling household where every occurrence was refracted through imaginative transformations. And then of course there are also fictionalized echoes of Dylan Thomas's encounter. He becomes a part of her imaginative constellation in some of the stories.
Yeah, well, she dedicated a story to him at visit, which has nothing to do with Dylan Thomas, but it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
And she makes a few mentions of Dylan Thomas in her letters to Jean Beatty, where that was the only place she really could let her hair down.
Yeah.
And she would just write these stream of consciousness, long typewritten letters to Jean. And they were wonderful, as you know.
Those are such great letters, really.
They really are. And it's the real Shirley talking. She's talking about Moomin and the Oz books and things she really loved.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, she's having trouble writing her book. And oh, by the way, she's troubled by these other things, or delighted by things. She could be as delighted with something a paragraph later. So it really is stream of consciousness. But
so this raises another question that I'm curious about. I mean, obviously there are zero-sum concerns. You can only make a book so enormous. But I'm curious as to whether you at least even saw the other side of certain of these amazing exchanges. And, because one can't read these marvelous letters to the, this confidant friend and confidant without fantasizing about what the return mail must have been like. You feel Shirley Jackson's excitement at the possibility of hearing from her friend. Did you see the other side of it?
I haven't, as a matter of fact, in that case. But we decided early on there just wasn't room to have any more letters. Much as it would have been fun to have Stanley's letters to Shirley, for example,
Of course.
or Bernice's letters back to Shirley, which were just as fiery and interesting as Shirley's were. They had a very good, very tight dialogue, the two of them.
It suddenly occurred to me to wonder, and I don't know the answer to whether, for example, James Thurber's letters must have been collected somewhere at some point. There must be a volume of his letters, and whether the letters to Shirley Jackson are in the Thurber volume.
Letter from Shirley, or you mean his?
Or the other way, that we would see some letters from James Thurber to Shirley in his book. I don't know whether you do or not, but
well, I don't know. To my knowledge, there's only the one letter that she wrote him when
Right.
he later was doing his book and asked her
Yeah.
how it had gone with the New Yorker during the pre-publication of Pottery.
Yeah.
And it went well. It went great. Go ahead.
What was it, Laurence? We had like 1,300 pages of letters. Sorry, I'm holding up. You can't really see. We had
Wow.
something like 1,300 pages of letters.
Yeah, we started out with a cubic foot of letters, typewritten,
Yeah.
and a cubic foot. That's a lot of letters. And
Yeah.
Bernice read all of them before we even began editing or culling. And so she
I was
knows.
very relieved, Laurence, that the vast majority were typewritten rather than handwritten, because Shirley's handwriting is
I know.
challenging.
We did have some handwritten letters, mainly on that trip to California in 1939. And
Postcard.
I had to translate them for the typists. I had to write above Shirley's writing what she's saying. And even then, I
Yeah.
wasn't always sure. She's writing in the back of a car or something. So that gives her a bit of an excuse. But it's true that her handwriting was not the best. Not very easy to read.
Yeah.
Which is why she said she typed everything. And
So, speaking of the typewriting, there's also the expressive quality of some of her typographical choices. First of all, it's very interesting just to see what she does with lowercase. The way that seems to be an expressive choice. I'm curious about that, and I think it's referred to as coming from Stanley that she began to use lowercase.
well, only that what we know from the letters, which is in the third letter, she says, "Notice if you haven't, that I've adopted your style of typing without capital letters." And she loved that. She just stayed clear of the shift key. But of course, when she was writing to her agents, she would write with caps and lowercase and paragraph indents and all the normal things that are expected. And to some other people, she would write in that style. But most of what she wrote, all of what she wrote to her parents, all of what she wrote to Stanley, all of what she wrote to Jean Beatty was all that lowercase. And I'm awfully glad that Random House agreed to keep that style.
I think it was one of the first kind of major conversations we had, wasn't it, Laurence, about whether or not to keep the typographic idiosyncrasies there, and we were like fully in agreement that it was such an important part of her letters. The character comes across in it.
Yeah, very much so. And she plays with it in the early letters. She says, "Oh, that sounds like E.E. Cummings," and just fooling around with this new freedom of no use of the shift key. And
she loved to run on.
And not only there, but she would write letters to us in lowercase. The letters would appear, notes would appear on the study door or on the refrigerator, written by Shirley, lowercase, sometimes cryptograms or puzzles or deliberately misspelled words. For her, it was just playful. And she just thought language was fun. And she enjoyed it thoroughly.
That's great. So I'm going to pause for a second to remind the audience that in maybe as soon as 10 or at least 15 minutes, I'm going to be looking to the chat and the Q&A in hopes that you'll help me talk with Bernice and Laurence and think of things. But I prepared a little surprise. I happen to be in Maine now, where my books are all hidden away, and so I pulled out some things, and I thought I would show off some beautiful and evocative covers, and let you free associate on these artifacts.
She's really so bemoaned. She would write her
So
mother
misleading.
and say, "Don't tell anybody you know me because the cover is horrible."
So I found another copy of her first novel where they even changed the title to make it sound a little more salacious.
I've seen that too. Yeah.
There's a 70s version, I think, a paperback that has in the back, "Welcome Wagon for Evil." I don't know if you have that one.
I don't think I have exactly that one, but this is the third paperback treatment I've got for Roads from the Wall, which is actually a kind of handsome one. I like that.
Yeah, that's not
And
bad.
And then here's your childhood being portrayed by the paperback artists of the 1950s. But there's a great story about, I think I've got the hardcover. There's a great story about her response to the original house on the cover.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that was our house. I mean, but
Yeah.
she had, yeah, I know, she took a lot of exception with the way it was portrayed. And in fact, in the earlier version, there were 5 children. And
Oh, really? The spare part, yeah. All right, let's see what else I've got. Well, I found a nice movie tie-in edition.
Oh, lovely.
As a fan of the film, it's marvelous seeing her responses and her delight and fascination with the process as it unfolds, and the even just the amusement of the visit, Robert Wise's visit to Vermont in April when he's wearing California clothes and expecting it to be comfortable.
And Shirley didn't even know who he was. I mean, that's kind of amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
But she has a nice undefensive relationship to the film adaptations that happened, and also just to the milieu of people coming and trying to make them. She seems just fascinated and amused and not anxious that titles are being changed or that things are going to be grossly misrepresented, which, of course they so often
right.
are. Yeah. But it doesn't seem to have made her paranoid or defensive to deal with that. No,
not at all. Not at all. She wrote variously depending on who she was talking to. She would write to her parents that the movie was simply awful and didn't do much for her. And then she would write her agent that it was fabulous and she loved it. She'd never imagined seeing her characters come to life like that. And she wants to see it many more times. So it's hard to know. I saw those movies with her, and I know that she liked them. She likes to say she closed her eyes and never opened them, but that's not true. She watched them. And she was a great movie buff. We used to go to the drive-in all the time together, and she loved movies. And she was extraordinarily pleased to have her books adapted into movie form. And I wonder all the time now, because there's so much interest in adaptation of her work, would she like this? Would she like that? Maybe she wouldn't like this. But I'm pretty convinced she would like all of it. She would be very surprised and extremely pleased and amused to know that we're even talking about her 55 years after she died, like this, and with a new book of her work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the remarkable things about her career is how, I mean, is another one that interests me very much.
Yeah.
The books that were put together, you are only the second family member to begin commemorating her with posthumous publications. And it isn't as though she wasn't publishing frequently and copiously during her life, but there's now been so much material revealed. I mean, letters, obviously, but so many lost stories and the I think quite brilliant unfinished novel that Come Along With Me is it's uncanny. It's one of my favorite things of hers, and I think one of the most interesting unfinished novels in literature. To wonder what might have come of it. That also comes out of my feeling that she was only getting better. That We Have Always Lived in the Castle is so much her masterpiece, and so the excitement at the thought of what she would have done to try to top it.
Yeah. Well, she was really prolific. I mean, she wrote hundreds of short stories, and a number of novels, and I don't know how she did it all in those few years, and with only being able to work for 5 or 6 hours a day at best. She would work in the mornings after she sent us off to school. Then she'd have to make our lunch when we came home for lunch, and then typically in the afternoon she'd nap. But then after dinner she'd go upstairs to her office and work for another 3 hours if she could. And, wouldn't it have been wonderful if somehow she could have just gone to the office at 9 in.the.morning and worked all day at her writing, the way many of her male counterparts were able to do. So, I'm not I mean, her life was her life and she loved it, but she spent a lot of time taking care of us kids, housekeeping, despite what you hear. She was a great cook. She loved to shop for food. She loved to cook. And eventually my sisters would do the cleanup so she could go upstairs and type. But, and of course she chauffeured my father around, who didn't drive. And she took us all to dentist appointments and dance classes. And, you know, she spent a lot of time running that household.
It's quite astounding. I mean, I felt the letters furthered an impression I had already gained from the biographies, that in a way she's a kind of an emblem of feminism in the way she managed to be, you know, she did have superpowers, and that was the only way that she could have written the work that she did. And yet she's also called upon to perform the kind of normative, to say, I'm the wife, I'm the mother, I'm the neighbor, you know, and so this work, this extra layer of work of presenting a non-threatening kind of cohesive familial image is really extraordinarily vivid in the letters.
And it's there from the start, you know, from very early on as well. I mean, there's a letter from one of the few letters, I think it's from the mid 1940s, isn't it, Laurence, to Lewis Harrop, and she's talking about baby Laurence, baby Laurie keeping everyone awake all night, and it's slightly slowing her down on her new novel, but she's still, you know, she's balancing motherhood, domesticity, and this remarkable career that really kind of, you know, took off very, very quickly. And, you know, she was a celebrity so early on in her career that it's really remarkable that, if anything, she only kept building on that and building on that and building upon that.
Well, and don't forget that in those early days, those same early days, she was or writing advertising copy for a radio station. You know, amazing. You know, they had to support themselves. And Stanley right away became a writer for the New Leader, and then almost immediately for the New Yorker. And he was a staff writer for the New Yorker all his life, basically. But that never paid very much. And his teaching, certainly at Bennington, didn't pay exorbitantly. So my mother's contributions of stories on a regular basis was just expected.
It's a remarkable story. I've got some lovely questions in the Q&A, and I think I'm going to offer them to you in sequence, and I'll just read them aloud. The first is very apropos in the sense of the things we're contemplating right now. This is from someone named Robert Lloyd, who says, well, first of all, thanks you very much, and says, do you think that the letters give us an insight into Jackson, particularly Jackson as a writer, that her memoirs and family sketches and essays don't? Would you say that the letters are more confessional than her other life writing? And I think that's a really interesting question, is how these contrast, or what space you see between the family essays, which were so prominent. You know, they were so public.
You want to take that, Bernice, or shall I?
Well, maybe if I start then, Laurence, and you chime in, and I'm sure. I mean, I think for a lot of readers, the sort of the revelations really of this will perhaps be the letters to Stanley, which from early on, the college letters, which are a part of her life that maybe a lot of her readers mightn't be quite aware of. Shirley Jackson as the college girl, incredibly excited and very much in love, and the intensity of that early relationship is it's there on every page. I mean, it really, really is. And then the sort of maybe the letters to Jean Beattie in particular, which were of course uncovered by Ruth Franklin when she was working on her wonderful biography. And I think there are sides of Jackson, and those in particular that I think will be new to a lot of readers, even if they are perhaps familiar with some of the earlier biographical work on her. So, and I think there's a you know, the BD letters, you know, they come with such, I mean, Laurence, there's certain times of the chronology where we have less letters, and the latter period of her life is one of those times. And so the BD letters are actually so vitally important there, because they're filling in actually a lot of what was happening in her life at a period where she wasn't actually writing a lot of other letters, and would subsequently actually have quite a severe case of writer's block. So I think those in particular are a side of Jackson that people may not be familiar with, and are really incredibly revealing, and have an intimacy that is really quite striking. So, I mean, Laurence, I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts as well.
Well, I agree with what you say, certainly. And I think that they are different. I think that they're similar material. She covered the same ground with her parents, certainly, as she did in many of her letters. And she even comments on that. She says, you know, I write you the same material I put in letters, I mean, in short stories. And it was pretty true, but there was much more sort of background in the letters than I think in the Family Chronicles. The Family Chronicles were, you know, they were all written as short stories and then strung together or assembled or collaged or whatever into the volumes they became. But the background for any of those stories, of course, would not have been included, and yet they're in the letters. So you can find out much more when she's writing her parents, or better, when she's writing Jean Beatty or you know, some of her other friends. There's another sort of angle at those stories that she gives us, and I think that the writing of the letters is just extraordinary. You know, it's an important literature, I think.
When I look at those family essays and source stories that are strung into the 2 volumes, what strikes me about them, I think now, especially having read the letters, is that the trick of those is that she sort of plays there's like a sleight of hand where she makes the person writing them disappear. The mother is kind of a funny, like, chalk outline,
Yeah.
who just experiences these things and somehow brilliantly reports on them to you, but isn't really a personality with demands or needs or opinions. They're just sort of the super recipient of experience.
Yeah, well, that's quite true.
I think too, the cartoon, or the cartoons they add such a level of wit and humor, and the depiction of Stanley in the cartoons.
Well, and
he's always in the armchair reading the New York Times or the New Republic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the last drawing, he's reading the Chicago Sun-Times, and she says, "Dear, you look so different tonight."
It's great.
Yeah, I think the drawings are wonderful, and I really wanted to include some. I wish we could have had more, but space was obviously an issue. But I think they add a wonderful dimension to the letters, and they're almost saying the same thing. You know, Stanley is very boorish and lazy and in his chair and not involved, but that's the way it was, you know. And
the one,
some of them are wonderful, you know.
Erotic personality of our times, where she's holding the axe behind him.
Sure. Yeah. Well, she did that drawing many different ways. Yeah, there are lots of versions of that one. But she's also always got a smile on her face, you know, when she's holding that axe. Another we didn't
like
same, yeah, and her hair going out in all directions like she's being electrocuted.
Yeah.
But that was just so playful of her, and yet not playful. I mean, it was playful on the one hand, but a real point is made in those drawings, and they're exposing the, you know, the expectations of women in those days, and the sort of the status quo of things. So I mean, ones like the one where Stanley says, "Dear, the doctor says you're supposed to have exercise." He's lying in a hammock. "So rock me a bit, would you?" I mean, come on. And then another one where he says, she's carrying all these loads of groceries, and he says, dear, you know, the doctor said you weren't to carry anything heavy, but he makes no effort to go pick up the bags.
Right. Let me keep at this list of questions because they're getting to be more of them, and they're very good. So this is a quite simple one, but very compelling, from Janice Deitner. I hope I'm saying the name right. And the question is, are there any letters that either of you wished could have been included, but that just couldn't be for whatever reason?
Yes, indeed. Yes, there were. You know, we had 500 letters and we just didn't have room for 500 letters. And we both, Bernice and I, you know, were quite worried about this, and it was a hard process to cull the letters and eliminate some. But we knew, and we've made a point, each of us in our introductory pieces, that we expect future scholars will access them and read them and enjoy them. And there may be many other letters discovered that we couldn't find, but that study will go on. This is not the last word. We're editing for a popular audience.
Right. So there could conceivably be a scholarly, you know, a complete letters. And so it would be very large. Well, so there are more questions here, and Aaron Richards asks a very simple one as well, but very nice, which is, what is the most surprising thing you learned about Shirley while putting this collection together?
You stumped me there. There wasn't a single surprising thing. There were many surprising things.
Yeah.
You know, the first letters from Shirley to Stanley showed me a side of Shirley that I never knew before. You know, she was 21 years old, or 22 as we get into it, and still very girlish, still very much a San Francisco kind of society person in her part of her thinking. Part of her other thinking, of course, was what Stanley was telling her, and what she was learning about the other side of the world, which she finally decided was more attractive than the part of the world she'd come from. I think that I really never really understood how hard she worked at writing until I read those letters, and how she struggled with writing. You know, she'd say, I'm going upstairs to work on my novel, but that would be like saying, I'm going upstairs to walk around on ground glass for a little while. You know, I didn't understand how hard she worked until I digested it.
That's terrific. Thank you. Okay, and so this circles back to this question of what scholars may go on to do, or whether it might be one or the other of you, and it's a very interesting question as well. This is Maria Teresa Mormon. Again, I'm hoping I say the name right, who congratulates you on the publication, and then asks, I think based on clues in the Ruth Franklin biography, that the belief that Shirley was was a more prolific letter writer than diary keeper. However, Maria is curious to know whether the two of you have any plans to collaborate on a volume of Shirley's diaries in the future. Is there a substantial amount of diaristic writing, and what's your relation to it?
I'll pass on that one. I haven't read her diaries. I know that there are several at the Library of Congress. I also know that she kept many diaries at the same time because she knew her grandmother was snooping and reading one. So she wrote that one so that the grandmother and the mother could deal with it. But she kept another one hidden that they didn't know about, that she really was
wow. That's fascinating. It's like the way the mafia keeps bookkeeping, double booking, double ledgers.
She knew for years that her mother and grandmother were snooping in her letters. She knew that, and they'd open her desk whenever she'd leave the house, and so she had no choice. She couldn't lock her desk any better than she did, so she fooled them.
I think it's something actually that Laura Miller's recent really detailed and perceptive review of the book in the New York Times. I think the headline was something like Shirley Jackson Alternating Identities, and Miller talks about that. I think she hit the nail on the head. It's, you know, that's what she did in the letters as well.
Yeah.
Different shades of Shirley Jackson.
Yeah, of course, she was referring to the differences in the sorts of writing Shirley did, you know, from the Family Chronicles, which are hilarious, and, you know, as compared to the more serious Gothic.
I think in the letters too, you can see that as well. She's kind of a slightly different Shirley to her parents than she is to her lay people. And of course, we all do that, but I think it's all the more striking in Jackson that it's you know.
Fascinating. Well, so this leads to a slight follow-up for me. I'm just curious, as a writer with an archive myself, you mentioned the Library of Congress. How did her papers move into the space where scholars can work on them? What was that process, and at what point did she leave instructions, or did she and Stanley devise instructions for how her archive was to be handled?
No, they didn't know she was going to die when she did. I mean, it was a complete surprise to the whole family.
Yeah.
She'd been in good health. There was no indication that she was about to depart the room. And Stanley just gathered up all her papers. I mean, literally all her papers, and put them in boxes and sent all that material to the Library of Congress, knowing that it had great value, great literary and scholastic value, but not being able himself to go through the editing and the separating of things.
Right.
So that there are lots of silly little things. There are shopping lists. There are all kinds of whimsical things. But in a way, none of it is whimsical if you're studying the writer.
Sure. That must have been enormously valuable to Ruth Franklin. Yeah.
And even her shopping lists would have the names of characters she's writing on the side as she's sitting in her kitchen on her stool making dinner and writing out a shopping list for tomorrow. And on the corner, she'll write Jim Donnell. She's just discovered the name, you know, she's just thought of it. And so she was always working, and she talked a lot about that. She's written a lot about that.
Right.
That the writer never stops working. You would know that.
Well,
in that you're always collecting impressions,
yeah,
dialogue and nervous tics and anything that you can use later.
Well, and her life and art had a continuous quality of dialogue. I mean, her response to the family's life, but also to the situation of being, you know, who she was, married to who she was, living in North Bennington. All of those things are of a piece. We've now gone through the questions that were lent us by the attendees, which I'm very grateful for, and we're coming towards the conclusion of this hour. And so my question for you is going to be the last one is going to be a bit of a traditional writer's question, Laurence. Is what are you working on, and does it extend your investigation into your mother's life and art, or do you feel that in a way you've discharged that?
No. I've got many projects. I'm happy to say that there's great interest in adapting her novels and some stories, and there are no fewer than 5 in development. Which, you know, 2 of them in England. Which is very exciting. I'm attached as EP on all of them, just because I want to have an ear in the room. And I want to help them not make mistakes, you know. And I think it's a valuable function for me, for them. So there's a lot of interest there. There are 2 children's books that she never completed. One, Abigail, she tried and tried and tried. And finally, John Farrar came up personally to discourage her from continuing it, and encouraged her to put it aside and focus more on her serious writing.
Yeah.
She was highly offended by that, but she put it aside, but she bemoaned that many times later. Anyway, I've got that, all her pages, and it's a great story. I don't know if it can be finished or kind of culled together.
Do you feel that it ought to be finished or presented as an unfinished draft? Are you not sure?
I think there's enough there in her own writing, finishing.
Yeah.
She's got easily a dozen different starts and lots of inner pages, middle pages, and she's got several endings.
Oh, well, that seems possible.
For an
Yeah.
editorial job, I think, and you know, a little bit of connecting the parts, but
Yeah.
you know, it's vintage Shirley. It's just for juvenile readers.
Did she try out the writing for juvenile readers on you kids? Was that something she would have done, or was it unknown to you whether she was writing for kids or adults at a given moment?
It was mainly unknown. She tried out lots of ideas on us, but I don't remember her trying out these.
Mhm.
Abigail was abandoned in the 50s.
Uh-huh.
And I think the Fairland of Far was something she was trying to do late in her career when she was having writer's block. And she decided she'd sit down and write a children's book instead. And then she was working on a book with my sister Sarah, Famous Sally, and encouraged, wrote it basically. And it was published posthumously by Harlan Quist.
Yeah.
So she liked writing children's books. And of course, Nine Magic Wishes is a wonderful book. Which has been, issued at least twice, once with my son Miles's illustrations. And that should come back into print. I'm not quite sure why it isn't, but we'll see.
Right. Great. Well, I think that we can let you go with again, my thanks and pleasure in this time to visit. And Bernice, I'm really pleased to meet you and want to find out what you're doing with California Gothic.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? California Gothic.
Yeah.
I'm in a hostage situation with it at the minute, so
I'm very
I
intrigued.
need to finish it before September. So yeah.
Yeah.
Really?
Okay.
Oh,
Good luck.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading the conversation. And thank you, Laurence, for continuing to share your mother's legacy with us.
Well, thank you.
Everyone.
Thank
you
you.
very much, Jonathan.
Thanks
you.
everyone, and thanks for all the good questions in the chat and for everyone attending. Keeping us
And
posted.
a pleasure, John. Thank you. Very much.
Yeah, great to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Bernie.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.